Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my meta friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I have great fun talking about meta-analysis with Paschal Sheeran, a social psychologist from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Paschal describes what meta-analysis is, what it has to offer, and how to apply it in your own work. Along the way, we also discuss taking off into the north versus the south, flipping people off, being subtle, metaphysics, most effective tactic available, fleeing Ireland, falling off a bus, taking the piss out of your own work, opposable thumbs, descriptive descriptions, sleepwalking reviewers, the Wild West, the importance of cake, living the dream, and the 5 stages of meta-analysis. We hope you enjoy our discussion. So I've been waiting to hear, did you take off into the north or into the south?
We took off into the south.
Oh! So a couple of days ago, Greg came down to Chapel Hill to visit. You can add 25% to the flight time, depending upon whether you take off into the north or into the south. Into the north, gear up to gear down is like 36 minutes or something. But if you take off into the south, you're screwed. Greg presented to our quant group here in psychology at Carolina. Greg and I have worked long enough together, have hung out long enough together that I just knew that once I turned the talk over to him, somehow I was screwed. I gave a nice intro and I sat down and then I just started to shake because somewhere in that talk was going to be something that I was not anticipating. I didn't have to wait long.
Yeah, I started off my talk just thanking all the people and then up come pictures of Patrick flipping me off over the years.
There were a disturbingly high number of them. Me flipping him off myself, me flipping him off from an Uber, me and Bauer flipping him off from the back seat of a cab, me and Preacher flipping you off from a Christmas tree, me flipping you off from a hospital waiting room, and then the coup de grace was my 5-year-old daughter flipping off the camera where you implied that it was intergenerational. My daughter had hurt her finger, and it was, of course, her middle finger. She said, "Daddy, my finger hurts," and held it up. I didn't ask how she was. I didn't ask if she was feeling okay. I said, "Wait a minute, I got to get my camera." And I said, "Now show me your hurt finger." And she did. And I said, "And show me your grumpy face." And I have the best picture of a 5-year-old flipping off the camera. The highlight for me was Greg turned to me. I was sitting in the front row, and up against my chest, I flipped him off as he showed pictures of me flipping him off.
It was the most beautiful moment for me. It all came together. So after Patrick flipping me off, I thought we had this little private moment. One of your students came up and said, "I saw what you did. That was so meta." And then walked away.
That is almost the definition of meta. I was flipping you off for showing pictures of me flipping you off. I started thinking about your love of words and where these things come from. And meta is actually an awesome word. When you start looking at it, there are like 2 or 3 or 4 different ways it's used. And it's even more and more used, especially by younger folks today. So it doesn't surprise me that a grad student said that that is so meta. Mm-hmm. If you look it up, one is denoting of change of position or condition. All right, so like metamorphosis, you're changing condition. Yep. One is denoting position behind, after, or beyond. This one I didn't think about, but like Aristotle's Metaphysics, that was the book he wrote after physics, and it was metaphysics, was following physics. But the third one that's kind of most useful today is denoting something of a higher or second order kind. So meta-language, metacognition, metadata. Mm-hmm. Those are like the formal definitions of the term, but not necessarily what the kids use.
That's right. So I sit in my office. My office is off of the living room, as you know, and my son sits there where he's supposed to be doing homework in the living room, but he also does his online gaming there. And I will hear him say, and I've heard him say this so many times, that weapon is so meta. Of course, is talking to other kids in his headset while he's playing. but it actually means something to them. Meta stands for most effective tactic available. So a weapon that's meta is like the best that you could possibly have in that situation. So when they're saying meta, it literally means something that is optimum for that situation.
You know what I also love is it just means awesome.
Yeah.
I think that pivots us into the conversation today because we are very excited to have a guest to talk with us today. And we are going to talk about meta-analysis, which, following the definition of wherever I took it, I don't remember, it is the analysis of analyses. I mean, how freaking cool is that?
So meta.
So we are both very excited to bring on Paschal Sheeran. Paschal is a colleague of mine. We're friends. We go back a decade. He is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience here at UNC. He is a social psychologist who studies self-regulation. He is also an adjunct professor in Department of Health Behavior in our very highly ranked School of Public Health here at Carolina. And he's an active member of the Lineberger Cancer Center, which is one of the top cancer centers in the world. Paschal, thank you for joining us today.
Welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we start, give us your origin story.
I grew up in rural Ireland, a small town called Portlaoise. If you looked at a map of Ireland, it's in the dead centre. The emphasis, I think, was on the dead. Neither of my parents finished school, interestingly, so I was extremely keen to go to university, not least because it got me out of Portlaoise. In Ireland, I went to the People's University, University College Dublin, and I did philosophy, psychology, and math in first year. And I did fine in philosophy and math and barely passed psychology.
You called it math just now, but did you call it maths in your prior life?
Oh, of course. You're bringing back all the memories of hood and bonnet and trunk and boot and pavement and sidewalk. I'm struggling to fit in.
One of the first things Paschal and I ever did, we were like, oh, we're going to welcome his family. And my wife had this great idea to go to an outdoor theater production of this puppet show. I don't know if you have a memory of this.
Oh, it's in places in my mind, given that it essentially repeated 30 times.
Oh,
be nice to the environment. Be nice.
It was 95 degrees in North Carolina in August. It's outdoor, and subtlety was no part of this. They were these disturbing puppets of these characters every 90 seconds. You're exactly right. The environment is our friend. Be nice to the environment. I can picture Paschal packing his boxes back up when he gets home, if this is what Chapel Hill, North Carolina is like. You and I both learned to be nice to the environment.
We did. I particularly liked your comment, Patrick, at the end, which is, that was a bit subtle for me. I think I might come back tomorrow night and see it again.
So you wrapped up in Dublin. Where did you go next?
Well, I did what all Irish people did in the early 80s. I fled the country. I went to the UK thinking I was about to commence a world tour, but actually there was no world tour. I just hung out in London and had a wonderful time. I mainly worked on building sites because the British would actually be living in mud huts, but for Irish people, you do know that. And eventually I progressed to blue-collar work. I became a bookkeeper. Mm-hmm. On my way to work one day, I fell off a bus, unfortunately. This was the days of the open-end red buses. I got a scaphoid fracture, which meant I could no longer control the movement of my thumb. So I ended up in plaster for 8 months, and that precipitated my return to academia because I could actually be a student, but I wasn't able to work. So I did a master's at University College Dublin again.
You're one of the most important social psychologists working in the area right now. And when a young person is listening and is trying to mimic what you did, the key turning point is you have to fall off a moving bus.
Basically.
If I understood correctly, the field you entered didn't require an opposable thumb?
You can turn the page with your left hand. It's fine.
All right. So now you've got a master's. Did you fall off another bus?
No, I fled the country yet again.
Uh-huh.
And this time I went to Scotland, and I was fortunate to work on the first social aspects of AIDS project that was funded in the UK. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate I met a great colleague, Charles Abraham, who steered me towards doing a PhD. So I went to London, what used to be called the North East London Polytechnic, and became the University of East London. And I started a PhD PhD there, and I got 2 years into the PhD and they ran out of money to fund me.
Okay.
I applied for every job in academia imaginable, and there was a 1-year lecturing post at the University of Sheffield. I had so over-rehearsed my talk that I could no longer take it seriously. As I was giving the talk, I was basically taking the piss out of my own talk. And I think they found it so bemusing. Oh, let him teach the students for a year. It'll be fine. After a year, they said, we'll give you a rolling contract, which meant that I could register for a PhD as a staff candidate, and I could just cobble together some publications, have 2 external examiners, and that's how I got my PhD.
So just straight shot into academia.
Absolutely. Straight down the line.
So then you moved into a faculty position.
Once I got my PhD, they could make my post permanent, and then I gradually clawed my way through the ranks at Sheffield. Mm-hmm. And then out of the blue one day, I got an email from Barb Fredrickson. Would you consider moving your research program to UNC Chapel Hill?
Well, your very first question was, do you have giant-sized puppets that teach you about the environment?
That was it. So I've been at UNC 10 years and have loved it.
Paschal is an amazing colleague. We could have the entire episode just talking about how you got into the field, what your work is. It's so much fun to talk about this stuff. But we've got a totally meta episode today.
Whoa.
You are one of the most important social psychologists studying self-regulation, working in the field right now. Yet at the same time, you are one of the most rigorous and effective users of meta-analysis as anyone in the field. And we want to talk to you about meta-analysis, what it is, how you use it, pros, cons, where you see things going. We've not yet had a chance on the podcast to talk about this as a technique. Could you give a 30,000-foot description? What is meta-analysis and what does it hope to achieve?
That's about 10,000 meters. Just so you know.
But only if you take off into the north.
Meta-analysis treats studies as data points. In a primary study, you collect data from individual participants, and if it's an observational study, you correlate, for instance, a self-control scale with the person's grades, and each person's self-control score and their grade constitutes the data in your study. A meta-analysis is really the same thing, except instead of participants being the unit of analysis, individual studies are the unit of analysis. So the correlation between self-control and grades obtained in study 1 is your first data point, study 2 through study 20 or 30 or whatever it is. So meta-analysis is simply a way of, instead of accumulating across participants as you would with a correlation or a t-test, it's a way of accumulating across studies rather than participants. It's very uncomplicated. The only thing it does is it's a weighted average. Larger studies simply get greater weight than smaller studies. If a study has 100 participants, it gets twice the weight of a study with 50 participants. And other than that, it's really, really quite simple. Despite the fantastic meta name, if you called it weighted average analysis, nobody would ever do one, wouldn't it?
Gene Glass is often credited with terming meta-analysis. He had some line about how the term may be a bit grand, but it is precise. I loved that.
You gave a very descriptive description of this, and I mean descriptive as opposed to inferential. When you gather data and you're doing that t-test in your study, you're doing that correlation, we often think about ourselves inferring back to a population, and so invoking all of the statistical machinery to do so. Do you think about meta-analysis, or do you practice meta-analysis as a descriptive endeavor to try to cull things together, or are you trying to make some inference back to something?
There are many different uses of meta-analysis. There are very descriptive studies. We have a study recently on what proportion of cancer survivors who quit at the time of cancer diagnosis subsequently return to smoking. The research question there is simply, what is the population level? How much of an issue is failure of smoking cessation among cancer survivors? That's one way. There are more inferential things like how strong is the relationship between self-control and grades, between self-control and health, and then how effective are interventions. That's my particular beat. So I'm kind of very interested in, well, we've done a lot of interventions to promote quitting among cancer survivors. How good are they? And in fact, they're not good at all, is what we found. Or how effective are different interventions to reduce exposure to ultraviolet radiation? With climate change, this is going to be a greater problem. Or which interventions are effective in promoting physical activity? There are a lot of inferential questions that you can ask using meta-analysis. A lot of my time with meta-analysis is spent not merely discovering is there an effect, because very often there isn't, but there may be under some circumstances an effect. Figuring out, well, what are the factors that actually make interventions more effective? When are they effective, or for whom are they effective, or for which behaviors? And for that, we simply use moderator analysis to try and work out, oh, maybe under this circumstance, that's when these interventions are effective. I have a nice example of that in physical activity for cancer survivors, because physical activity for cancer survivors is wonderful medicine. And what we find is that supervised exercise sessions are really effective. The Cohen's d-value is 0.69. Most meta-analysts would get up in the morning for a d-value of 0.69. Given that we get up in the morning for a d-value most days of 0.2 or even 0.15, 0.69 really gets us up in the morning. The difficulty is that supervised exercise sessions are incredibly expensive. This is unlikely to be implemented at scale. So what we were able to do was, well, okay, let's say we don't have the resources for supervised exercise sessions. What can we do with unsupervised sessions? And what we found was there was a particular technique where you promote positive but realistic outcome expectancies. You don't bullshit people about how great it's going to be. You say it's going to be good, but realistically, this is what you're likely to achieve. If you use that technique, promoting realistic expectancies about physical activity, and the intervention occurs over an extended period, greater than 12 weeks, then you can actually get an effect that's just as good as supervised sessions. The d-value there was 0.70. Which you really get up in the morning for.
If you were like right on the border before.
This cheers us up no end.
In a single study, potential moderators might be biological sex or age or socioeconomic status. But if you scale it up, so can we verb it? We can meta it up to where now instead of the individual as the unit of analysis, we have a study as a unit of analysis. Then do you code characteristics of the study as predictors? Are those the moderators?
Yes, they're the moderators. And in fact, our coding frames are 12 to 20 pages long. You try to think of every feature of the sample, every feature of the method, and then very often we code the techniques that were used in the intervention, as well as features like intensity, how long it went on for, how many sessions, what was the total contact time. So you're trying to identify, well, what are the factors that predict the magnitude of the effect size? And very often you will find things that both enhance the effect size, but it's remarkable how often people do things that actually serve to reduce effect sizes. A particular bugbear of mine is workbooks. In almost every meta-analysis I've done, using workbooks is the kiss of death.
It would seem like one of the hardest problems is just getting all the stuff on the table to begin with before you even code it.
Oh, absolutely. This is where UNC libraries deserve a bow. We are fortunate to have numerous fabulous medical librarians, and essentially they do the computerized literature searches using multiple databases. Not only do they do that, they get rid of duplicates. There is a delightful program called Covidence that enables multiple coders to go through the title and abstract of every paper to figure out, does this meet our study inclusion criteria?
And the literature that you just made reference to are the things that your wonderful medical librarians have access to or that is in the database. Are there sources of studies that exist outside of our usual world that we have to work extra hard to get pulled in?
It's surprising how many papers don't turn up on databases that actually we can include. And we used what's called descendancy approaches, which is that we searched through the reference list of papers that meet our inclusion criteria to see if some of those studies could also make it in. I would stress how unbearably tedious this is.
For the medical librarians.
No, for the research assistants.
Okay.
This involves a lot of cake and a rather profound kind of concern for the mental well-being of one's research assistants. I mean, in some of our meta-analysis, we've had more than 30,000 records that have been distilled down to maybe 150 studies that actually meet our inclusion criteria. So So a hit rate like that, 3 in 1,000, it's kind of ugly and extremely hard work.
In our world, there are often tech reports that are more in-house for particular research agencies, and they're doing great stuff. It's just they're doing it for their own purposes, and they may or may not have the goal of getting that out into the community. And I think, oh my gosh, I really would like to be able to have access to that.
We write to the listservs of professional bodies. Even if people are working in private institutions, they're very often still members of professional bodies. So we have a list of listservs.
Ooh.
How meta is that? We write to them asking, this is what we're doing, and this is the topic of our review. Here's our inclusion criteria. Do you have any studies that are unpublished or in press that you could share? And you always get a few studies that way.
It seems the more insidious problem is one of the cornerstones of what's been argued with the replicability crisis, which is the file drawer problem. You're still talking about stuff that lives out in the wild, but there's whole strata of stuff that you cut your losses and moved on because you didn't find a significant effect. How do you handle that?
There are a number of techniques for correcting for publication bias. The one that's most commonly used is called trim and fill. Trim and fill simply assumes that the distribution of effects should be symmetrical. It should be normally distributed, essentially. Mm-hmm. When you look at the observed effect sizes, very often you'll see a hole in the distribution, usually on the bottom left.
Shocking.
Small negative effects are underrepresented because people either didn't bother attempting to publish or they weren't successful in publishing those studies. And all trim and fill does is estimate if those studies were included in the meta-analysis, how big would the effect size be then? That's one of the problems. Another big problem is that meta-analysis is a great way to become disillusioned with your field and to profoundly believe that editors and reviewers sleepwalk. Because when you're looking very carefully at papers, you realize all of the information that's left out. Very simple things like people will report how long the intervention went on, but they don't report how many sessions or the total contact time. If you want to know the dose of the intervention, that information is critical. So we spend a lot of time writing to authors going, please tell us. In fact, I'm working on a paper at the moment about who responds.
Really?
Yes. It's quite fun. People in public universities respond more, and people funded by NIH respond more.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it fun?
A couple of years ago, we did an episode on something like Patrick's truly horrible bad idea, something like this. It's the worst idea I've ever had, and that is saying something.
Oh my gosh.
Competition is steep.
Yeah.
I have very seriously pondered ways of doing what I have called post-publication review, which is doing a publicly posted review process of papers that have already been published, and having, from a very simplistic perspective, almost like an Amazon star system for the overall quality of just the method and results. I mean, honestly, some studies are higher quality than other studies, even though in the numeric coding that you would have, they look to be the same. Do you have a way of incorporating a numerical assessment of simply how good the study was?
Oh, yeah. And that's quite crucial. The Cochrane collaboration developed something they call the risk of bias checklist or toolbox.
Wow.
It's a way of coding the caliber of the study. Is there blinding of participants? Is there blinding of the researchers? What's attrition bias like? Is there selection bias in terms of the recruitment of participants? Unfortunately, researchers don't seem to have quite tuned in to the importance of providing this information. And my suspicion is there's very often, studies are really quite good in terms of quality, but they don't indicate in the paper that participants were blinded or that researchers were blinded. I'm fast coming to the point of view that when people publish a study, they should produce a meta file alongside it that actually provides information on was there blinding, so that rather than having poor meta-analysts go through the study trying to figure out was it blinded, people just indicate in advance this, and this were true.
You described all of these characteristics as moderators, but what that makes me feel is that every study is its own unique snowflake, and I don't know how to... I mean, yes, I can build moderators into a model to try and cut all through that, but this is going to sound silly. It just feels so hard. I don't know what I'm getting out in the end. I know what I want to get out in the end, but I feel like every single study, it depends. It seems like a very formidable task, to say the least.
Meta-analysis is not for snowflakes. I can say that. I can say that definitively. If it's subtlety you're looking for.
I work with Patrick, so no.
I think that the tricky bit here is finding the dependent variable that actually really is similar across studies. So most of my work is behavioral, and that really helps me in the sense that I'm asking how often people do A, B, or C. Do you attend for colorectal cancer screening? Have you quit smoking? How many steps did you do? Ideally, most of those things can be measured objectively, or at least by devices, or not by self-report. And you can always check how the device-based versus the self-report measures marry up. There's an awful lot of talk about the lack of validity of self-reports, but our experience is it's surprising what people will admit to.
I love that there's some attempt to calibrate things and to assess the validity of the outcomes because, again, sort of as this naive person looking in from the outside, one of the things from the world that Patrick and I live in is the issue of reliability. How much noise is in each of your outcomes? And if I imagine having an outcome, not like the outcomes you're talking about, but in a variety of other kinds of settings where the outcome is, I'll make something up, children's motivation. I go, oh, great, I've got all of these studies on children's motivation. And then I look at it and they're using 43 different definitions and instruments for motivation. And some are complete homebrewed crap that someone threw together. Some are more established instruments. I don't know how to think about aggregating things where even just the quality of information is so different across all of those.
It's a great point. We've got an ongoing review of quit intentions and smoking cessation. You would think in a field that's so important that people would have arrived at some agreed measure of motivation. But no, we can identify families of different approaches to motivation. So there are theory, plan, behavior, protection, motivation theory people who use measures of intention. I intend to quit or I will try to quit. And then there are stages of change people who use kind of readiness measures. And it is a big problem. Very often we will do sensitivity analysis where, okay, if you used a standard measure of intention, then you compute the effect size just for that measure of intention and then calibrate the other measures against those. And we will also code idiosyncratic, which is the nice word for research or made up.
Right. Yeah.
When I think about your work, it really did make me start thinking differently about an individual published study. I have groused before about how I feel like one of the real weaknesses in a lot of areas of psychological research is an over-reliance on a single study. We have now determined that this is effective, or this is the relation between X and Y. But what I love about the work that you're doing in this procedure in general is you start looking at an individual study differently. You start looking at it as a datum in a future meta-analysis. What you do and how you use meta-analysis, can that inform some standardization of even procedures, not just reporting? If you had the control, would you put up some guardrails on, if you're going to study this, this is what you have to do? Or is part of the challenge just it's the Wild West and it's your job to try to get a signal out of the noise?
I lean towards the Wild West kind of approach in the sense that all studies have flaws. The hope is they have different flaws and that across these different flaws, we still see some signal. I think there's a meta point about meta-analysis. New heights of pretentiousness here.
It's meta-pretentious.
I don't really see meta-analysis as a summary. I think there's a temptation to go, okay, we'll run a meta-analysis and then we'll know the effect.
It's 0.36.
Exactly. And it's always 0.36. I think the point of a meta-analysis is to discover where to go next. And very often to conceptualize the effects we do have a lot better. Very often we will find, hey, there's no overall effect, but actually there seems to be an effect here. And actually our theories are not very good at telling us why we might observe an effect here. They should pose a theoretical challenge, but they should also pose an empirical challenge, because if we develop a theory of why we have an effect under this circumstance but not that circumstance, then we need primary work to actually test that and really unravel it. I think there's a temptation to see meta-analysis at the end point And I really don't think so. I think it's a tool to drive research forward, a way to look across the data that have been collected in order to figure out where should we go next? Where are the holes in our understanding?
That is fascinating because of the meta-analyses that I've read, almost to a paper, it has been, we are searching for the truth as God sees it.
Yep.
And that this is the relation between X and Y. Indeed, it's almost the opposite of what you just said. We don't need to study this anymore because this is what it is. I find that comment profound because if it's almost like, all right, let's stand down, let's look at everything that we've done in a principled way, and then let's lay out a map for where to go next. I find that reassuring in my increasing concerns about the state of our science.
Any particular meta-analysis is, the moment it's published, it's a historical artifact. Mm-hmm. By the time you get the paper published, the data are at least 2 years out of date because it just takes so long to do. The finding could easily be overturned in a new meta-analysis. And the question really becomes, well, why would it be overturned? What's changed? One of the most disturbing findings I've come across, because I do work on behavioral interventions, I'm curious about how time relates to effect sizes. And there is a part of me thinks, well, surely we're learning and getting better at this. But I have yet to find a study where the magnitude of effect sizes improves over time. And I think that's kind of a promise of science. We kind of get better at this. Well, we found this was effective relative to this, and now we found this is relative effective to that. That kind of slightly worries me. It's something very important about meta-analysis. Remember, meta-analysis is almost invariably, for when it comes to interventions, it's comparing an intervention versus a control group. So the effect is driven as much by the control group as by the treatment arm of the trial. If there was anywhere that standardization might be valuable, I think standardizing what the control arms in trials are. One of my favorite papers by Marijn de Bruin. It's a delightful paper. So he coded what went on in all the intervention conditions and in all the control conditions. This is for adherence to HIV medication. And then he tries to predict the effect size in each study, it's a meta-analysis, from what they did in the control arm versus what they did in the treatment arm. And he found that 75% of the variance in effect sizes could be explained by differences in the control arms. And only an additional 5% was explained by the treatment arm. The place to look at the Wild West is in our control conditions. And I think we're very good at talking the talk about, well, we need to control for time and relevance and a few variables, but we're very imprecise about what goes into a control condition. And I think that's an area that we really need to consider, particularly for important behaviors where actually you want interventions to be improving over time. And we're not finding that.
You're just a stuck record on that point, that science should get better with time.
I mean, you don't find this in drug trials. Each succeeding drug is compared to the best available. And I'm not sure that's how we treat control arms in behavioral trials. The virtue of meta-analysis that isn't true of primary studies is that you can actually test what content or what techniques used in control conditions lead to smaller versus greater effects in treatment arms.
But so here we are. You've done all the work. You've culled all of the studies. You've given cake to whomever needs to have cake to get all the stuff. It's an integral part of the process, it would appear. You've contacted authors, pulled the information out of those people who were kind enough to share it at the public institutions. Now you have to do things analytically. It's certainly more than a weighted average analysis, right? There are a lot of knobs and stuff that you're twiddling. Can you tell us a little bit about the methods that are going on when you're doing these analyses?
To be perfectly honest, most of the work we do, we simply run through Stata and it generates the outcomes. We can specify different parameters, restricted maximum likelihood, empirical Bayes. Once we have the data, the easy part is analyzing it. An important development that's only really occurred within the past 2 years is the delightfully named meta-analytic structural equation modeling.
Oh.
That's living the dream, that is.
Yeah.
Okay, the academic dream. We've got to contextualize that.
And it's called MetaSAM.
Of course.
We've done one study using MetaSAM. The real issue is about the precision of the theories. Self-determination theory says that we can promote behavior change because we will increase people's autonomous motivation, which means that they feel they really want to do it, not because other people want them to do it. So we gathered, I think, about 65 interventions that measured health behavior outcomes like physical activity, smoking, and so on, undertook a randomized trial, but also measured autonomous motivation and perceived competence in the wake of the intervention, and ideally measured behavior sometime later. And we could use MetaSAM to discover, did the intervention indeed promote the outcome by changing autonomous motivation and perceived competence? And in fact, that's what we found. Most of the effect was mediated by autonomous motivation, and some of the effect was mediated by perceived competence. The intervention no longer influenced behavior once the mediators were taken into account. Meta-analysis combined with structured equation modeling can enable us to test key theoretical propositions across studies, and that's quite fun.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is profoundly cool. It is meta-cool, if I might say. At what point did you fall off another bus and learn this? If there's somebody out there saying, oh, damn, this is really cool, what would you recommend for how to get the skills to do this in your own work?
I discovered meta-analysis through a talk by Ralph Schwarzer at a European Health Psychology conference. He gave a talk on social support and health and talked through how he'd done the meta-analysis. And actually, he developed a little MS-DOS program, inevitably called Meta, and shared it online. So you just went to the Free University of Berlin, you downloaded the program, and he had a delightful manual that explained the rudiments of meta-analysis and did cool things. How do you turn a t-test or a chi-square into an R value? How do you turn an F ratio for two groups into a D value? It was all explained so beautifully. It's just a wonderful document. I still have it. That's how I acquired it, and I believe the Meta manual is still online, and I'd warmly recommend it to anybody. It's a delightful, simple, straightforward, user-friendly introduction. There are a lot of good meta-analysis courses, I'm sure, in almost every department in the country. If you go in with the attitude that actually this is just weighted averages, and you don't allow the word meta-analysis or heterogeneity or publication bias to intimidate you, I think it's something you can pick up very, very quickly.
Well, I love that as one of your messages, that this is doable. This is not the high priestesses who kindle the flame in the cave, is that this is a general linear model analyzing the results of multiple studies.
Really good courses appreciate that meta-analysis is very often learning by doing. You've got to get your hands dirty. And I know the couple of the courses here at UNC, students are asked to identify a small body of literature and to run a meta-analysis themselves as part of the assessment. That's a wonderful way to learn because it causes you to realize that actually all the work virtually is not in the math. It's not in running the meta-analysis. It's in being precise about what your research question is, being clever to restrict things to a relatively manageable number of studies. If you decide to do what is the relationship between self-esteem and depression, you will be doing a meta-analysis for the rest of your life. But if you look at the relationship between self-esteem and, for instance, openness to information, well, then you actually got a much smaller number of studies to look at. If you're clever about the formulation of your research question, there's no reason why you can't actually run a meta-analysis over the course of a 12-week course.
Well, what I love, too, is, isn't that what we should aspire to do in a single study? What is your research question? Yeah. Keep it focused. Take a clever approach to evaluating it. It's almost just good science.
And this is why I think pre-registration, particularly for meta-analysis, is really valuable. It forces you to be explicit about what it is you're trying to do in advance. More than once, as I developed a pre-registration, I went, oh my God, I'm not doing this. Pre-registration is a really good test of your stamina and capacity to make yourself suffer. And pre-registration forces you to do that. And everybody can read it. And it causes you to lower your ambitions to something that's both desirable and feasible.
So I would say that you've been incredibly inspirational. To me, who's someone who's very ignorant about meta-analysis, I view it as daunting, but you also framed it as manageable. Are there any parting words for people who say, all right, I am going to go through this door, I am going to wade into it? Anything we need to be thinking about as we bravely cross that threshold?
I think one should bear in mind Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of meta-analysis. The first stage is excitement. One is thrilled, one has found a hole in the literature, it's going to be marvelous. Then you start to gather the literature and excitement turns to hope. And you kind of go, yeah, I can do it. The initial excitement is starting to dissipate. Then the next stage is what I call, it's not really a feeling, it's called realization. It's like, oh my God, this is just so much work. There are so many references. Dear sweet Lord, I will never see my children. Shortly after realization comes despair. You're into record 25,000 and the end does not seem to be in sight. And you're also looking at the data and going, oh, I don't think the findings are going to be very interesting. And that's despair. And then finally, there's resignation. You just realize, I've got to do it. I just have to finish it. In the same way, I think is it Louis C.K., the greatest thrill for a parent is the end of a school concert. The greatest thrill for a meta-analysis is definitely submitting the paper for publication so you don't have to look at it for several months again. But knowing these stages, and this is where things get meta, knowing these stages helps you as you go through.
I'm sorry we ran out of time. I really wanted to talk more about the environment. Maybe you and I can go off mic and talk about how we should be kind to it, as told by a deeply disturbing 20-foot paper head of Charles Darwin.
It lingers in the mind, doesn't it? It really lingers in the mind.
Thank you so much, Paschal.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We always appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. All the best. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for things that sometimes maybe should have been left in the file drawer. You can also follow us on X, where we are at QuantitudePod, and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, listen to past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, you can get cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast that never met a dad joke it didn't like. Huh? In fact, today's episode has been sponsored by the Meta Society for the Meta Use of Meta Prefixes. When you're trying to help your field experience a metamorphosis, but your metacarpals are sore from all the metadata you've been preparing to meta-analyze, and you find your metacognitions drifting to the metabolic distress you're experiencing that requires you to drink Metamucil, and...
Dad?
Oh, hey, Sid. That was pretty meta, right? Did I knock you off your metatarsals into another part of the metaverse?
Dad?
Metaphorically, I mean. Maybe I should post about it on Facebook. You know, whose parent company is now called...
Meta.
My work is done here. This is most definitely not NPR.
Save me.